Chapter 3. Izzy pushed herself up from the couch, her muscles aching. How long had it been since she had cared about how she felt? The house echoed with the sounds of Lula and her mother-in-law working. Neither of them had been in to look at her in quite a while. She was loath to bother them, but she needed to find relief for nature's ache after drinking so much water when she had arrived. Conrad had left out the door at the far end of the room, so that had to be the way out of the house. But where to go from there? Why couldn't she remember getting from the horse to the couch? It was a blur to her. As she pushed open the door, the beauty of the rolling green hills with verdant grass the color of the prettiest emerald stopped her where she stood. While they were outside of the great black hills in Belle Fourche, the land itself seemed to buckle in pretty soft rolls that invited her eyes to roam from one crest to the next. Barton walked toward her from one of the barns with a ready smile. He had hair the color of caramel and wore every color of brown in both the fabric of his clothes and the dust covering him. "Afternoon, Izzy. Good to see you again." He tipped his hat to her, ever the gentleman. "Lula came out and told me you'd arrived earlier." After Barton had been her teacher for a few months at the normal school, before she had been married, she couldn't think of him as anything else, not even the husband of her closest friend. Though she had witnessed the wedding, she hadn't seen them since. "It's good to see you as well." She nodded in greeting, but her need was great. Though it was rude, she tipped her head to search around the house. "I'll show you around so you know where you can and can't wander, but you're welcome to stay as long as you like. In fact, we'd welcome a nice long visit. Lula doesn't venture to town often, so my ma is her only real companion. I know she's worried with the coming of her time, and who will be here with her." Though she knew next to nothing about what a birth would entail, that would be a reason to stay. It was so much better than the truth, which was that she wasn't truly welcome anywhere else. She couldn't bear the thought of her mother putting her in mourning. She wasn't mourning, and never would. At least, not him. Not in truth. He first took her around next to the necessary, a whitewashed, functional building far away from the house for privacy, and then, as if he knew her problem without her saying a word, he pointed to the other buildings around, the various barns, the stable, and paddock. He pointed out which fences she had to avoid because of the bulls, and where she should avoid because of steep drop-offs. As a pair of riders came in, Barton waved, and they nodded in return. "On the right is Eli, the left, Arnold. They are the two brothers you haven't met yet, but soon." As she watched the two riders, it was easy to spot how different they were. Eli wasn't as broad of shoulder as Conrad. He was more similar in build to Barton. He had a dark mustache trimmed nicely, and a gaze that seemed to take in the whole ranch. Arnold wore a red bandana around his neck that had been over his face. He was dusty from above his nose to his hat. Barton dipped his hat once again. "I'd best get back to work. Good to see you, Izzy." And he sauntered off, leaving her to her urgent business. That done, she was able to take a good look around. The front paddock had a stock of fresh horses waiting for the drivers when they returned to exchange a tired mount for a rested one. Beyond that were two barns, one with machinery and another for calving. They hadn't mattered much when she had needed the privy, but now that Barton was gone, she could take a closer look. The bullpen was to the left of the machinery barn. Behind the necessary was vast fencing, but none of the cattle were close enough to see. Izzy roamed to the paddock, unsure of what she should do with her time, now that she had neither home nor husband to care for. The horses stood about with little to do, in the same predicament as her. The ground was little more than fine dust within the fence, and the horses were saddled, ready for their next rider, but had nothing to do but stand there and swish flies until they were needed. If only she had purpose in the same manner. even waiting for something would be better than knowing nothing. Since she had wed prior to completing her 1 year of teacher training, she'd never finished, so she couldn't teach. She had no husband, no future, and no prospects. Before she had married, Lula had been her only friend. From the far end of the pasture, a rider approached at a solid lope. His steady form brought to mind home and her family. All 7 of her brothers were cattle ranchers with her father, most of them married. There had been no room left for their one daughter, especially a daughter they had thought was taken care of. During the 2 visits her mother had made to see her, she had tried to impress upon Izzy that sometimes husbands and wives didn't see eye to eye. No amount of explaining would dissuade her from that thinking, that what Harlan did was more than just lead her. To her mother's mind, Izzy's marriage was normal and just fine. To her own, if that was a normal marriage, she never wanted to partake again, not that anyone was lining up for the job. The rider drew closer, and Izzy backed off from her perch on the bottom rail of the fence. Harlan would have said she was too heavy to be standing on it, and she might break it. Conrad's handsome face dipped behind the brim of his hat as he nodded and dismounted just outside the corral gate. "Izzy, good to see you out and about so soon. Wasn't sure if you'd spend the day resting. Seemed like you might need it." His kind, reassuring words hit her like a brick. Even when Harlan had been wooing her, it had been more about stolen kisses than caring words spoken just for her. He'd found out how to reach her parents through the office at the school, and had made her ma and pa think things were much more serious between them than they were. He'd come home with her on Christmas holiday, and had easily convinced them he was the best man for her. And on the way home, without her parents present, he had taken her to wed by a judge. She'd been so caught up in the feelings that someone actually wanted her, she hadn't realized important things were missing from their relationship, like the simple care that Conrad had just shown. "Miss Izzy? Did I say something amiss? I'm sorry." Suddenly, his firm, reassuring hand was on her arm, and his face, worry written across his brow, searched her own. How could she have been such a fool to miss those signs in Harlan? The clues had been there, and she had missed them all until it was too late. "Would you like me to take you back into the house? Maybe being out here is still a little too much. I'm sure Lula has a bonnet you can borrow too when you're ready." He didn't move to resume his work. His warm, strong hand lingered on her arm, steady, supportive. He wasn't pushing her or trying to control her. Was she so starved for a kindness that she couldn't even think straight when someone offered her a taste of compassion? I'm sorry for standing on your fence." Confusion replaced worry for a moment, and he glanced down at her feet. "Stand on it all you want. I've seen tumbleweeds bigger than you." She shook her head. His words sounded false to her starved ears. "You're right. I should go back into the house. I'm sorry for bothering you. Please excuse me." She had to get away before she cried in front of this man. He was a man, and once she showed a weakness, he would use it against her. He held her still, and she didn't have the heart to walk away. "Izzy, you're welcome out here any time. If you want to ride or go to town, anything, you just let Lula, me, or Burton know. You're our guest, and we'll make sure you get whatever you need. You have my word." She had an overwhelming urge to throw herself into his arms and cry. How could she have been so thoughtless with her life? She had wanted to be a teacher, and it was forbidden that she wed. But she had done it anyway and ruined her chances of ever teaching anyone. She had given up her dreams of teaching for a man who didn't love her, who couldn't even give her the same kindness as this stranger right in front of her. Conrad's hand slipped off her arm and slid to her back as he drew her along by his side. She had hardly realized they were moving. When they reached the steps, he slowed his pace so she wouldn't trip over her hymns. "There now, you go rest." He pulled open the door and held it for her. "We'll have you fit as a fiddle before you know it. This land, it heals." His face shone with pride as he turned from her and took in the whole ranch with a sweeping glance, and she couldn't help but follow suit. It was beautiful, the grass greener than she had ever seen, the sky a perfect blue with wisps of clouds floating on the breeze. "I pray it does, Conrad." Conrad strode into his father's den. Though his pa had long given up on working the ranch with his sons, they still met there to talk where no hands could hear. His brothers, Arnold, Eli, and Barton, were already waiting for him. They had been through so much together, and even though Barton was a full 10 years younger than him, and annoyed him to no end, he'd take a bullet for his little brother. Arnold glanced up from the conversation and nodded to Conrad. "Now that we're all here, we can get started. Last week there was some kind of miscommunication, and somehow sacks of flour were ordered instead of grain. We'll never use this much flour, and Harvey's won't take it back because they had to order extra just to fill it. We'll have to figure out how to use it." Conrad had asked Stan to run to the store to pick up the feed he had ordered the week before, but he'd been sure he had asked for feed, not flour. What could they do with all that? If he had gotten the full amount Conrad had asked for, there would be 10 50-pound sacks, more than enough for years, if flour would keep, which it wouldn't. "Are we planning to bake enough bread for the army?" Conrad tried to joke to take the charge out of the room. He had to get to Stan and talk to him before his brothers did. The problem wasn't funny, but he couldn't leave his brothers asking why he hadn't gone to the store himself. He'd only ever gone to pick up orders, not to make them. He didn't even trust himself to take a list that Ma or Lula had written, in case Harvey would ask him about something on it. His brothers might not think him fit to stay as majority owner if they knew he couldn't read. He was starting to doubt it himself. Then again, maybe he could put the new teacher to use. She could read for him. And if he tried to be smart about it, she might never know it was because he couldn't. Eli picked at his fingernail, then glanced around the group. "Don't know about the army, but we might be able to get back a little of that money with a bake sale or something." Arnold shook his head. "No, there's enough flour there to give a bakery a good go. We've got too much to do to be messing with it. Maybe we can see if anyone is in need, but it may just be a loss. We'll store it down in the cellar where it's too cool for the weevils, and pray we can find a good use for it." Conrad stood, ready to be done with the meeting. "Is that all we've got?" Barton glanced up, and a smile slid across his lips. "What is it, big brother? Got plans for the evening? Aren't we good enough company for a few minutes?" It still irked him that the youngest of the Olsons was the first to marry. He should have been first. He should have put more effort into it. Now he was old, having just reached his 31st year, too old for the young ladies to look at, and all the more mature women were married, except for spinster Irma Jean, but she was a spinster for a reason. "No, I don't have any plans. I just thought all of you might want to spend an evening in front of the fire instead of together, since we are with each other all day." Barton scratched his chin. "Well, I sure do like spending the evening with my wife. Too bad none of you have that option." He laughed as all three brothers flung their hats at him, and he dodged out of the line of fire. Conrad didn't doubt for a second that curling up to something that would curl back was most pleasant, but he'd deal with being alone if that was what the good Lord had planned for him. For now, he had to think of a way to use or get rid of that flour. As long as it sat there, the family would wonder about it, and it was only a matter of time before the questions led back to him.